Hello there, and welcome. Before you get too comfortable, why not take a moment to like the video and subscribe? Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together as we turn our attention to the quiet, peculiar, and surprisingly enduring history of a place so small, yet so singularly persistent on the map of Europe, the Principality of Monaco. Nestled along a gentle bend of the Ligurian coastline, bordered on three sides by the rolling French Riviera and washed eternally by the waters of the Mediterranean to the south, Monaco is barely more than a speck, scarcely larger than a square mile, and yet dense with memory. It is a place where geography and survival have danced a slow, complex waltz, played out over centuries in the soft hum of tides and the slow crumbling of stone walls under sea winds. Its history is neither brash nor grand, but composed rather like a quiet melody of minor keys and subtle persistence. This was never a kingdom of empires nor a land of sweeping conquests. Instead, it was a rock, a literal one at first, Le Rocher, a promontory jutting out into the sea. Over time, that rock became a refuge, then a fortification, then a home to a family whose name would become synonymous with the place itself, the Grimaldis. Their hold on Monaco, starting from a stealthy incursion in the late 13th century, has continued, with only brief interruption, for over 700 years. A rare continuity in a continent so often rewritten by the sword. Yet Monaco's story is not just that of the Grimaldis. It is also the story of fishermen and merchants, of monks and masons, of quiet lives lived within its narrow terraced streets. It is the story of resilience, of diplomacy over violence, of leveraging location when land was scarce, and of finding a space between great powers by staying just small enough to be ignored, but just valuable enough to be protected. So tonight we will begin our slow wander through this place. From the earliest traces of human presence, through classical antiquity, the medieval reshaping of the coast, and onward into the quiet pages of Monaco's sovereign story. We'll take our time, breathing in the sea air of centuries past, and tracing the contours of a history both modest and strangely enduring. Long before the name Monaco ever adorned a banner or echoed from the mouth of a herald, there was simply the rock, a pale, sun-bleached limestone promontory rising from the blue. It would have been visible for miles at sea, a landmark as ancient as time itself, marking a point along the great curve of the Mediterranean where land softened into cliffs and the sea whispered endlessly against stone. In those earliest days, there were no walls, nor dwellings, no royalty, nor riches. But there were people. Archaeological evidence suggests that this stretch of coast has been touched by human presence since prehistoric times. In the caves of Saint-Martin Gardens and along the inland slopes leading up to the heights of the Tête de Chien, fragments have been found. Tools shaped from stone, traces of early hearths, bones of hunted animals, the quiet signature of life in the deep shadow of antiquity. These early inhabitants would not have called it Monaco, of course. Names in that era were transient, spoken and lost, passed orally across generations like birdsong. Yet the place itself remained, a small, enduring outcrop between sea and hinterland, offering shelter from storms and a view from which one could see far across the water. For peoples who lived by the rhythms of tides and seasons, this rock would have been a valuable sentinel. By the time classical antiquity arrived, the rock had already begun to accrue a certain symbolic significance. The Greeks, voyaging westward in their great seaborne expansion, came upon this place and marked it in their maps and myths. They called it Monoikos, meaning single house or solitary dwelling. It is likely that the term referenced the isolated nature of the site, a lonely outpost between more populated stretches of coast. But as with so many names of the ancient world, myth soon mingled with geography. The Greek hero Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, was said to have passed this way during his labours. A small temple was erected in his honour, nothing grand, but notable enough that the name stuck. Port of Heracles Monoikos, it was called in some accounts, and in time, the latter word, Monoikos, would be softened, Gallicized, and shortened into Monaco. It is important, though, not to imagine too much permanence. This was not Athens or Rome, nor even a busy provincial capital. Monoikos remained what it had always been, a stopover, a landmark, a station along the great coastal routes that tied together the sprawling networks of the classical world. Ships would have anchored in the small natural harbour, sailors disembarked to trade or rest, perhaps to make an offering at the shrine. The daily life here would have been humble, fishermen mending nets, traders haggling over olive oil or salted fish, children running among the olive trees, all beneath the gaze of the unchanging sea. By the 1st century BCE, the Romans had folded this coast into their empire. The Via Julia Augusta, a great Roman road named in honour of the Emperor Augustus, skirted the nearby hills, connecting Genoa to Arles. Monaco was part of the Roman province of Alpes Maritimae, though again it was a small piece, of little political consequence, but quietly significant as a waypoint. Roman engineers improved the roads, perhaps expanded the harbour slightly, and ensured that the shrine of Hercules remained tended. Coins from this period occasionally surface in the soil of the old town, their worn faces bearing the likenesses of emperors long since consigned to dusty history. Even in those centuries of Pax Romana, when Roman governance brought relative peace and stability to the region, Monaco remained modest. It never grew large, never bloomed into a city with its own senate or grand amphitheatre. And when the Western Roman Empire faltered in the 5th century, the coast fell quiet once again. Invasions came from the north, Ostrogoths, Vandals, Lombards, all searching for footholds in the crumbling Mediterranean world. For a time, the rock may have been abandoned. The temple to Hercules fell into ruin, stones repurposed for homes or fortifications. The shrines grew over with grass. The sea, unchanged, continued its endless rhythm. Through the early medieval period, the region was caught between shifting allegiances and frequent raids. Saracen pirates, striking from North African coasts and Iberian outposts, troubled the Ligurian shores. Monks from Lorraine and other monastic orders sometimes took refuge along this part of the coast, drawn to the solitude and safety of the rock's elevation. These early religious settlements would have been sparse, perhaps a chapel, a hermitage, or a cloister tucked into the clefts of the hill. By the 10th century, as the Holy Roman Empire began to exert influence in northern Italy, and the coastal cities of Genoa and Pisa grew in maritime strength, Monaco found itself once more under the watchful eyes of larger powers. The Genoese in particular were expanding their reach along the Ligurian coast. For them, this rocky outpost offered a strategic advantage, its high vantage point ideal for a watchtower, its tiny harbour a convenient shelter for ships. And so, the stage was slowly set for the next chapter. From humble beginnings, the Rock of Monaco had moved quietly through the pages of time, not as a centerpiece, but as a place of continuity. It bore witness to the rise and fall of empires, the migration of peoples, and the persistent pulse of maritime life. Still small, still modest, but unmistakably there. and in the centuries to come, it would become something else again, not just a marker on a map, but the seat of a family and the nucleus of a sovereign state. In the quiet continuum of Mediterranean history, there is a curious comfort to be found in the echo of footsteps along well-worn stone. Across centuries, through changing tongues and creeds, certain places endure not by force of arms or declaration, but by their geography, their quiet usefulness. So it was with Monaco, known in the days of classical antiquity as Monoikos, a small outpost nestled where the sea meets the hills along a route trodden by sailors, merchants, and soldiers alike. As we draw a little closer to the Hellenistic world, somewhere around the 6th century BCE, the Greek presence along this coast began to take clearer form. These were not the Greeks of Athens or Sparta, but settlers from Phocaea in Asia Minor, who had sailed westward in search of trade and new opportunities. Their colonization of Massalia, modern-day Marseille, became a springboard for a chain of outposts along the Ligurian and Provençal coasts. Monaco, or Monoikos as they called it, was one such waypoint. There is little evidence of a true city here, more a coastal station than a settlement of any scale. Still, the Greeks recognized the rock's strategic significance, especially as a marker along their maritime routes. The legend of Heracles passing this way took root in Greek imagination. Whether fact or poetic flourish, it gave the site a certain mythic weight. They erected a modest shrine in his honour, and with that, the name Portus Herculis Monoisi found its way into maps and scrolls. The shrine itself may have been no more than a columned portico overlooking the bay, a place for offerings, and perhaps a small altar. Pilgrims, sailors, and traders might have stopped briefly to pay their respects, laying wreaths or pouring oil in ritual. These gestures, humble and repetitive, connected generations in shared belief, even if they never lingered long. As Greek influence waned and Roman dominion rose, Monaco passed gently into the orbit of the Republic and later the Empire. There was no conquest here, no razing or revolution. It was more a matter of inheritance, of one map absorbing the faint ink of another. The Romans, efficient and observant, took note of Monoikos and its geographic convenience. By the 1st century BCE, the region had been incorporated into the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis. Julius Caesar himself, in his Commentari de Bello Civili, makes mention of the place, Portus Monoici, as he called it, while recounting his journey across the Alps into Gaul. For Caesar, it was but a waypoint. For us, it's a small thread linking this quiet rock to the great narrative of Rome. Under Roman care, infrastructure slowly improved. The most significant change was the construction of the Via Julia Augusta, a great arterial road named for Augustus, linking the Italian peninsula with Gaul. This road, completed in the early 1st century CE, passed close to Monaco, winding through the hills and offering a more reliable land route for trade and movement of troops. While the via itself did not descend fully to the harbour, its proximity gave the region new purpose. Messengers, traders, officials, each passed near the rock, and many paused there. One can imagine the slow plod of oxen carts laden with amphorae, the sound of hobnailed sandals on stone, the occasional clink of coins exchanged at roadside stalls. Along the hills above the rock, small villae rustici, country estates, might have dotted the landscape, their owners cultivating olives or grapes in narrow terraces. Below, fishermen still worked the inshore waters, mending nets and gathering shellfish in the shallows. Yet, despite these developments, Monaco remained modest. It never took on the stature of nearby Roman settlements like Simiers or La Turbie. It had no great forum, no amphitheatre, no aqueduct. The rock was not a centre of power, but a reliable outpost, peripheral but not forgotten. A lighthouse may have stood above the port, maintained by local stewards, casting a flickering flame into the dark for passing ships. As centuries passed, the tides of history turned again. The Western Roman Empire, increasingly brittle by the 4th and 5th centuries, struggled to maintain its hold over the provinces. Barbarian invasions, first the Visigoths, then the Ostrogoths, and later the Lombards, disrupted the fragile peace. Coastal settlements were frequently raided or abandoned altogether. Trade diminished, roads fell into disrepair, and many small outposts reverted to near silence. It is likely that during this period, Monaco's occupation was sporadic at best. The shrine to Heracles, once tended by Roman priests, was allowed to crumble. Its stones may have been quarried for defensive walls or taken by local farmers for use in boundary markers and homesteads. The terraces grew wild. The old road, though still traceable in parts, lost its imperial function. And yet, the rock remained. Its silhouette unchanged, it endured as a physical constant in a world unravelled by migration and change. During these centuries, Christian monasticism began to stir. Small communities of monks seeking solitude and spiritual purity found their way to the coastal highlands. The rock, with its isolation and commanding views, may have offered shelter to a handful of such ascetics. A chapel here, a cross hewn into stone there, quiet echoes of a changing faith. In time, new political structures would emerge. The Franks, the Carolingians, and later the Holy Roman Emperors would cast their long shadows across the region. But for now, in these post-Roman centuries, Monaco drifted in the margins, neither fully forgotten nor fully integrated, a place suspended between sea and story. Its future, still wrapped in the mists of possibility, waited patiently. As the first millennium came to its quiet end and Europe began the slow and uneven process of reawakening, the Mediterranean too stirred. Trade resumed, cautiously at first, then more briskly. Towns along the Ligurian coast emerged from the long sleep of the early medieval period, and with them the familiar patterns of maritime life returned. Sailboats in harbours, goods exchanged along wharves, and the steady rhythm of waves against stone. Amidst this revival, the city of Genoa began to rise. Perched further along the northern curve of the Ligurian coast, Genoa in the 10th and 11th centuries evolved from a modest port to a burgeoning naval power. Its citizens, a mix of merchants and mariners, turned their eyes not only westward towards the open sea, but also eastward along the shore, seeking to consolidate influence over the smaller coastal settlements that dotted the Gulf. Monaco, or rather the rock upon which it stood, was among these. Though still unfortified, the rock offered obvious advantages to anyone with ambition. It was elevated, commanding an excellent view of the sea. Its harbour, though small, was serviceable, and its location placed it within a day's sailing of Genoa itself. More importantly, it sat between rival spheres of influence, provincial powers, local lords, and distant kings, all vying, in small ways, for control of these fractured lands. In the year 1191, a quiet but significant event took place. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, seeking to curry favour with Genoese allies during his campaigns in Italy, granted the land of Monaco to the Republic of Genoa. It was a formal recognition of what had already been, in practice, a slow accumulation of Genoese interest in the site, yet the document brought with it new legitimacy, and with legitimacy came stone. By the start of the 13th century, the Genoese began to construct a fortress atop the rock. It was no palace, no decorative residence, but a proper military outpost. Thick walls rose from the limestone foundation, parapets edged the cliff top, and a modest watchtower overlooked the harbour below. From its high vantage point, guards could see far out to sea, spotting hostile sails long before they arrived. The fortress, though functional, changed the landscape of the rock permanently. What had once been open slopes and sparse dwellings now became structured, enclosed. A small garrison was stationed within, perhaps a few dozen men at first, supported by supply ships from Genoa and provisions from nearby villages inland. The outpost became, for the first time, a truly defended site. With the military presence came civilian life. Craftsmen followed soldiers, and then families followed craftsmen. By the middle of the 13th century, a tiny settlement began to form around the base of the fortress. It was not much: stone dwellings with narrow paths between them, perhaps a chapel, a cistern for water. Yet from this clustering of human life would grow the city of Monaco. Still, life here was not easy. The coast remained vulnerable to piracy, particularly from the Barbary corsairs and Saracen raiders who occasionally roamed these waters. The surrounding terrain was steep and difficult to cultivate, forcing most food to be imported or gathered from the hinterlands. Disease was a frequent visitor in confined quarters, and above all, politics was a shadow that never fully withdrew. Genoa itself was anything but stable. The city was riven with factionalism, most famously between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, two rival political camps with allegiances respectively to the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor. These rivalries often spilled into outright violence, not only within the city, but across its territories. Monaco, distant though it was from Genoa's inner streets, could not help but feel the effects. In 1270, the internal turmoil of Genoa reached a critical pitch. The Ghibellines seized power in the city, forcing their Guelph rivals into exile. Among those exiled were members of the Grimaldi family, an influential noble house with strong mercantile and naval ties. They were driven from Genoa, but not defeated. Like many noble exiles of the period, they looked elsewhere for opportunity and for revenge. It is in this context that the Rock of Monaco, fortified but sparsely held, became a target not for conquest in the grand sense, but for reclamation, a foothold from which the Grimaldis could assert themselves anew. This period in Monaco's history is thus not only about the laying of stone, but about the quiet accumulation of tension. The fortress was in place. The land was nominally Genoese, but its fate was not fixed. It hovered, as it so often would throughout the centuries, between larger ambitions, between the policies of states and the plans of individuals. In the shadows of its new walls, something stirred. A family, a name, a new chapter, yet unwritten, waited, with patience, sharpened by exile. It was the waning days of December in the year 1297, and the coast lay quiet under a pale winter sky. The Rock of Monaco, with its modest fortress perched against the sea breeze, had known its share of watchful nights. Garrisoned by forces loyal to the Ghibelline faction of Genoa, the outpost had settled into routine. Low fires, guards at the wall, the slow rhythm of patrol. Few among them would have expected what was to come. Fewer still would have recognized the man cloaked in the habit of a Franciscan friar who approached the gate before dawn. His name was François Grimaldi, a scion of the noble Grimaldi family, once prominent merchants and political figures in Genoa. François had lived the last decades in exile. The Grimaldis, aligned with the Guelph cause, had been ousted during the internecine strife that shook Genoa through the 13th century. Some fled to Provence, others to Sicily, but all retained their networks, their grievances, and their longing to return. Monaco, lightly defended and far from Genoa's centre, presented an opportunity. Disguised as a friar seeking shelter, Francois approached the gates with a handful of followers concealed beneath cloaks. The ruse, perhaps aided by familiarity or by the disarming presence of religious garb, worked. The gate was opened. In a matter of moments, steel flashed, shouts rang out, and the rock was seized. It was not a great battle. No trumpet sounded, no armies marched. But in the soft grey hours of that morning, the course of Monaco's history turned. The Grimaldi emblem, a red and white lozenge pattern, soon flew from the ramparts. Though the coup was modest in scale, its implications were substantial. For the first time, Monaco was in the hands of a family who would not merely occupy it, but shape it. The Grimaldi's claim was not born of ancient lineage tied to the rock, but of circumstance, strategy, and persistence. In a world of feudal rights and legal complexities, theirs was a tenuous hold, but it was a beginning. Francois himself, though remembered as the founding figure, would not hold Monaco long. Genoa, displeased and determined, reclaimed the fortress within a few years. But the seed had been planted. The Grimaldis would return again and again through diplomacy, marriage, and further bouts of conflict to press their claim. Over time, they would secure not merely a fortress, but a domain. In the decades that followed the initial seizure, Monaco's status remained precarious. The Genoese sought to maintain control, often alternating between direct governance and local proxies. Yet the Grimaldis, descendants of Francois and his cousins, persisted. Charles Grimaldi, a relative who would later become a key figure, managed to reclaim the rock in 1331, this time more firmly. He began to solidify the family's presence. Administrative structures were introduced, and modest fortifications improved. The small civilian population, composed largely of Ligurian and Provençal settlers, began to identify more closely with the Grimaldis than with distant Genoa. There was no grandeur, no royal court. Just a lord, his household, and a slow rooting into the stone. It is worth pausing here to consider the nature of this rule. Monaco was no great prize. Its arable land was scant, its population meagre. But it offered something more subtle: autonomy. For a noble house exiled from their homeland, the rock was a sovereign toehold. From here, the Grimaldis could conduct affairs with neighbouring powers, trade along the coast, and, crucially, negotiate their place within the shifting mosaic of late medieval Europe. The fortress, once purely military, began to assume more residential qualities. A small chapel was restored, dedicated to Saint Devote, Monaco's patron saint, whose cult had grown modestly among sailors and locals. A few more homes were built, and with them came births, marriages, and the quiet hum of civil life. Relations with Genoa remained strained, skirmishes continued, and for many years Monaco's rule alternated depending on wider conflicts. Yet each Grimaldi return, however brief, added to the family's growing claim of legitimacy. By the early 15th century, the name Grimaldi was nearly synonymous with Monaco. What Francois Grimaldi had begun in a friar's cloak became, over time, an enduring political reality. Outside the rock, Europe was changing. The late Middle Ages were a time of war and plague, of peasant uprisings and dynastic shifts. Monaco, small and enclosed, felt these winds distantly. There were hardships, of course, poor harvests, outbreaks of disease, but the Grimaldi's presence offered a semblance of continuity. By the mid-15th century, the family's rule was more or less undisputed, though not yet formalized in international law. They controlled the rock and its tiny hinterland, maintained modest trade through the harbour, and sought recognition from greater powers. It is here that Monaco's peculiar identity began to take shape. No longer just a fortress, not yet a state, it existed in the margins. Sovereign in the smallest sense, but determined, governed not by abstract ideals or grand visions, but by a family whose endurance was born of exile and patience. And still the rock stood, weathering time, quietly watching the sea. In the slow hum of the 15th century, as Europe edged through the final chapters of the medieval era, life in Monaco moved at a gentler rhythm, unhurried, enclosed, and shaped by the enduring silhouette of the rock. With the Grimaldi family now more firmly established, though not without occasional interruptions, the small community nestled beneath their watchful gaze began to settle into a pattern of living that would, in quiet ways, endure for generations. The early Grimaldi lords were not monarchs in any grand sense. They were seigneurs, lords of a modest domain, tasked as much with the management of daily life as with diplomacy or defence. Theirs was a rule defined less by ceremony and more by necessity. Monaco, though strategically valuable, remained a place of limited resources. There were no vast estates to farm, no gold to mine, no surging rivers to power industry. What it offered, above all, was position, a vantage point from which the Mediterranean world could be observed and occasionally influenced. Within the fortress walls, life was simple but orderly. The ruling family lived in a residence gradually adapted from the old Genoese stronghold. The rooms were modestly decorated with carved wooden furnishings, woven tapestries to soften the stone walls, and windows that overlooked the harbour far below. The chapel of Saint Devote, rebuilt and cared for, was the spiritual heart of the tiny settlement. Its bells marked the hours, its services offered solace, and its annual feast day brought rare joy and processions. Surrounding the rock, a small cluster of homes formed the town proper. Stone-built, with red-tiled roofs and wooden shutters, these dwellings housed fishermen, craftsmen, and labourers. The streets were narrow and stepped, winding to accommodate the terrain. At dawn, the town stirred to the scent of baking bread, the creak of cartwheels, and the low chatter of neighbours greeting the day. Goats clattered over the cobbles, hens pecked at stray grain, and the sea offered its salt-heavy breeze to every corner. Fishing remained the primary occupation. The waters just offshore, though not abundant by modern standards, yielded enough to sustain the population. Sardines, anchovies, and small tuna were caught using hand nets and lines, hauled ashore in long, shallow boats. The catch was cleaned on the stone quay, salted for preservation, and either consumed locally or traded westward to markets in Nice or eastward toward Liguria. Occasionally, larger ships brought spices, wine, or fabrics, small tokens of a wider world that brushed against Monaco's quiet shores. There were also terraced gardens on the hillside, carefully tended. Though the soil was thin and rocky, it yielded olives, figs, and citrus, alongside hardy vegetables like beans and cabbage. Wine was made in small quantities, often coarse, but sufficient. Chickens, goats, and the occasional pig provided eggs and meat. There was little waste. Rainwater was collected in cisterns, every piece of timber reused, and clothing patched and passed down. Education was limited but present. A few literate monks and priests provided instruction to the sons of artisans or officials. Most girls, and many boys, learned through apprenticeship or labour. Reading was a skill of the few, writing even more so. but knowledge was carried in stories, songs, and habits passed from one generation to the next. Under the Grimaldis, justice was dispensed directly. Minor disputes over property, theft, or family matters were often resolved through the Lord's appointed officials, or in some cases, by the Lord himself. Punishments ranged from fines and public penance to, in more serious cases, imprisonment or exile. Yet the scale of the community made such matters personal. Everyone knew everyone. A thief was not anonymous. A dispute between neighbours echoed for months. Religious life, meanwhile, marked the cadence of the year. Lent, Easter, All Saints' Day, each brought with it changes in diet, clothing, and activity. On Sundays, the town rested. Processions wound through the narrow streets, incense curling into the sky. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals unfolded with quiet dignity, their rituals binding the townsfolk to one another and to the broader rhythms of Christendom. Though Monaco was small, it was not isolated. Messengers came and went. News from Genoa, Savoy, or Provence was shared in the market square, sometimes weeks after the events had occurred. Treaties signed, battles lost, a pope elected. Each item of news was digested slowly, its implications discussed by fishermen leaning on oars and widows peering from windows. The Grimaldis themselves remained engaged with the wider world. They sought alliances through marriage, negotiated trade rights with neighbouring territories, and occasionally hired ships to support distant ventures. They walked a fine line, appearing loyal to larger powers when needed, but always preserving the illusion of independence. Their rule depended not on might, but on tact. A misstep could invite Genoese retaliation or draw the ire of a regional duke. So they governed quietly, with care. Piracy remained a threat. From time to time, Barbary corsairs raided the coast. Watchmen kept vigil from the heights, and when sails were spotted, the alarm was sounded. Doors were bolted, livestock herded to safety, and the fortress became a refuge. Such incursions were not common, but they were remembered. Children were warned of them in bedtime stories, and women clutched rosaries at the sight of unknown ships. Despite these occasional fears, there was stability, and in that stability, something began to root itself more deeply. The people of Monaco, though few in number, began to think of themselves not merely as Ligurians or subjects of this or that lord, but as something else, as Monegasques. A community defined not by conquest or creed, but by the quiet endurance of place. By the end of the 15th century, the Grimaldis' hold on Monaco was firmer than ever. Their residence had grown into a palace of sorts, still modest, still practical, but with signs of permanence. The town beneath it had taken shape, with named streets, a small council of elders, and records kept in careful script. A harbour wall was built to protect the quay. The chapel of Saint-Devote was expanded, and the flag, the red and white of the Grimaldis, was stitched and flown with pride. What had begun in exile, under cover of a friar's cloak, had become, quietly, steadily, a home. As the 16th century unfolded across the Italian peninsula, it brought with it a long and tangled chapter of conflict. A slow, grinding sequence of wars known to history as the Wars of Italy. Beginning in 1494 and lasting in various forms for over half a century, these wars would embroil nearly every major European power of the day. France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States, and a host of Italian duchies and republics. Armies marched and countermarched across plains and hills. Cities were sacked, alliances redrawn. It was, in many respects, a period of continual instability. And yet, amid all this turmoil, the Rock of Monaco endured, small, unassuming, and positioned just delicately enough on the edge of events that it avoided devastation, while still feeling the tremors of the world beyond. At the beginning of the 16th century, Monaco was ruled by Lucien Grimaldi, a capable if cautious seigneur who understood well the fragility of his domain. His position was delicate. The Republic of Genoa remained a latent threat, and Monaco's independence was not yet recognized by any international power in a formal way. It was effectively self-governing, but without the protective umbrella of a larger kingdom or alliance. Lucien's approach to governance was pragmatic. He maintained quiet diplomatic contact with both France and Spain, attempting to play the two great powers against one another without overcommitting. His aim was to secure Monaco's continued autonomy, ideally under the protection of a strong patron, but never so closely bound that the principality might be absorbed or subjugated. Yet not all threats came from without. In 1523, Lucien was assassinated in his own palace, killed by members of his extended family in a bid to seize control. The conspiracy was quickly quelled, but it left Monaco shaken. Governance passed to Lucien's young son, Honoré I, who was still a child. In his stead, Monaco was administered by his mother, Blanche, and a council of regents. It was during this regency that Monaco's political course would take a decisive turn. In 1524, Monaco formally aligned itself with Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The Treaty of Burgos, later ratified at Tordesillas, placed Monaco under Spanish protection. It was not a loss of sovereignty, but rather a carefully negotiated relationship whereby Monaco retained internal autonomy while receiving guarantees of security and recognition. For the Grimaldis, this was a crucial step. Spain was the dominant military power of the day, and its fleets patrolled the western Mediterranean. With Spanish backing, Monaco could deter aggression from Genoa or France and ensure a degree of stability. In return, it offered Spain a fortified harbour and a loyal outpost along the Ligurian coast, a small but useful prize. The Spanish alliance brought other changes too. Spanish envoys began to pass through Monaco more frequently, and Spanish influence crept into court customs, architecture, and even language. Trade with Iberian ports increased, and the Monegasque garrison, though still small, received training and supplies from Spanish officers. A few Spanish coins began to circulate alongside local currency. For ordinary townspeople, life remained much the same: fishing, farming, and quiet routines, but the shadow of a larger power now lay gently across the streets. The wars of Italy continued to rage beyond the borders. Battles were fought at Pavia, Rome, Naples. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and thousands of lives lost. But Monaco, nestled in its rocky niche, was spared the worst. Troops occasionally passed nearby, and news of sieges and treaties arrived by courier. Yet the town itself was never occupied, never sacked. Its neutrality, carefully managed and diplomatically maintained, proved its best defence. Under Honoré I, who assumed personal rule in the late 1530s, Monaco pursued a policy of cautious engagement. The Grimaldi ruler corresponded regularly with Spanish officials, ensuring that the principality remained in good standing. But he also sought to distance himself from the broader military campaigns. Monaco was too small to raise armies, too vulnerable to risk involvement. It became in many ways a listening post, a place where envoys stopped briefly, where ships resupplied, where information moved quietly. Within the town, life carried on in familiar rhythms. The streets were still narrow, the houses close set. olive oil and salted fish remained staples of the diet. The church remained central to community life, and the festivals, St. Devote's Day, Corpus Christi, Easter, offered moments of shared celebration and solemnity. Education improved slightly as clerics affiliated with Spanish monastic orders began to offer instruction to the sons of the better-off families. A modest school was established near the palace. The bells still tolled, and the sea still sighed against the quay. By mid-century, Honoré's reign had become one of gentle consolidation. He invested in the repair of the fortress, ensured the collection of taxes, and maintained cordial relations with his neighbours. He understood, as his ancestors had, that Monaco's survival depended not on force, but on its ability to endure, to be overlooked when dangerous and remembered when useful. The wars on the mainland dragged toward their conclusion in the 1550s. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559 brought a relative peace to Italy, with Spain firmly established as the dominant power. For Monaco, this was confirmation of its strategy. The alliance with Spain had protected the principality through a tumultuous era, and for the time being, peace prevailed. Honoré died in 1581 after a reign marked by stability and quiet growth. He was succeeded by his son Charles II, who continued his father's policies with much the same careful hand. By this time, Monaco's position as a Spanish protectorate was firmly accepted, though its internal affairs remained in the hands of the Grimaldis. In the broader view, the 16th century had been one of survival. While the great powers clashed over the fates of kingdoms and empires, Monaco held its place, small, steady, and largely untouched. Its people endured through prudence, diplomacy, and the quiet constancy of place. And the rock, as ever, looked out over the sea, unchanged. As the 17th century dawned, the Principality of Monaco remained a study in contrasts. Small and sovereign, fortified yet exposed, bound by alliance yet quietly independent. The rock, now crowned with a weathered palace and surrounded by a town of some 300 inhabitants, looked outward upon a sea whose breezes carried more than just salt and spray. These were the winds of diplomacy, piracy, and shifting power, and the Grimaldis, now styling themselves as princes, navigated them with a blend of caution and quiet determination. The beginning of the century saw the rule of Honoré II, who inherited the principality as a child in 1604. His early years were overseen by regents, but as he matured into authority, he became one of the most significant figures in Monaco's early modern history. It was under his watchful care that the Grimaldi domain evolved from a feudal holding into something more akin to a state, however modest in size and ambition. Honoré II understood that Monaco's future depended not merely on fortifications or pacts, but on legitimacy. He sought recognition not as a local lord, but as a sovereign prince, a ruler in his own right. This subtle but important distinction would allow Monaco to participate in the great theatre of European diplomacy, to send and receive ambassadors, to appear on maps with dignity, and most importantly, to lay claim to the protections afforded to sovereign states. The first challenge was Spain. Though the alliance had protected Monaco for nearly a century, it came at a cost. Spanish influence was pervasive, and garrisons, though small, remained stationed near the principality, ostensibly for its defence. Trade favoured Spanish ports, and Monegasque policy was expected to align with Madrid's interests. For a prince hoping to assert independence, this was a quiet burden. In the 1630s, Honoré II began to shift Monaco's orientation. He sought support from France, whose power was rising under the guidance of Cardinal Richelieu. France, eager to counterbalance Spain in the Mediterranean, saw value in Monaco's position. Negotiations were cautious but fruitful, and in 1641 a formal treaty was signed, known as the Treaty of Péronne. Under its terms, Monaco renounced its allegiance to Spain and accepted French protection instead. The change was significant. Spanish troops were withdrawn, and France pledged to defend Monaco's sovereignty while recognizing Honoré II as an independent prince. For the first time, the Grimaldis were acknowledged as true sovereigns, not just feudal vassals or rebellious nobles. The court of Louis XIII even offered Honoré a French title, Duke of Valentinois, and welcomed him at Versailles. Monaco remained small, unchanged in scale, but its status was elevated. The principality sent envoys to Paris, received foreign visitors with ceremony, and began to adopt the stylings of minor royalty. The palace was expanded and adorned with frescoes and galleries. A new facade was added, and gardens were planted where once there had been bare rock. It was still modest by European standards, but a clear symbol of Monaco's evolving identity. Yet the century was not without its hazards. The sea, as always, brought danger alongside trade. Corsairs, many of them from the Barbary coast, remained a constant threat. These pirates, operating from Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, prowled the western Mediterranean, capturing ships and raiding coastal settlements. Monaco, perched on its exposed promontory, was not a frequent target. Its walls and alliance with France offered protection, but its fishermen and traders were vulnerable. Boats disappeared, families mourned, the harbour bristled with awareness, and every unfamiliar sail on the horizon was met with wary eyes. To mitigate these threats, Monaco maintained a small fleet, little more than patrol vessels, but sufficient for deterrence. Watchtowers along the coast were manned, and arrangements were made with other small states for mutual alerts and ransom efforts. Life carried on, but never without caution. Within the principality, Honoré II also oversaw a quiet cultural flowering. The arts, though never lavishly funded, received modest patronage. Religious institutions were supported, and the Jesuits were welcomed to improve education. A small theatre was occasionally erected in the palace courtyard for travelling troops, and musicians were employed to perform at feasts and holy days. These were modest refinements, but they added a sheen of civility to the principality's austere edges. The townspeople, too, felt the effects of this subtle transformation. Life remained hard, sustained by the sea, by gardens carved into steep slopes, and by careful trade, but it was more orderly. Records were better kept, and laws more clearly codified. The town expanded slightly, its streets paved and lit with oil lamps by the later decades of the century. Children played in courtyards, goats grazed beneath terraces, and church bells marked both the sacred and the mundane. Honoré II died in 1662, having ruled for nearly 60 years. His long tenure had brought Monaco out of its medieval shadow and into the soft light of European modernity. He was succeeded by his son, Louis I, who continued his father's policies and strengthened ties with France. Louis, educated in Paris and familiar with courtly customs, brought a slightly more aristocratic air to the rock. He hosted banquets, received nobles, and sought to maintain the principality's careful balance between modesty and dignity. Through the late 17th century, Monaco remained largely at peace. The major wars of the period, the Franco-Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, unfolded beyond its borders. Occasionally, Monaco's name appeared in diplomatic correspondence, or a prince offered token support to a French initiative. But the rock itself remained untouched, its quiet walls weathering the same sea breezes they always had. By the century's end, Monaco had become what the Grimaldis had long hoped it might be, a sovereign, if humble, principality. It had avoided conquest, survived political shifts, and established itself as a legitimate participant in European affairs. Its palace, its chapel, its harbour. They stood not as monuments to grandeur, but as evidence of persistence. And still the sea whispered, the gulls circled, and the quiet life on the rock continued. As the 18th century approached, Monaco stood quietly upon its weathered rock, now firmly linked to France by ties of protection and diplomacy. The Treaty of Péronne, signed in 1641 under the stewardship of Honoré II and Cardinal Richelieu, remained the principal document defining the relationship. Monaco had cast off the shadow of Spanish oversight and stepped into the warmer, if still complex, embrace of the French crown. The treaty, in its essentials, was a compact of mutual convenience. France agreed to defend Monaco's sovereignty, recognizing the Grimaldis as independent princes, while Monaco promised to act in alignment with French interests, particularly in maritime affairs and the general equilibrium of the Mediterranean. The arrangement allowed the principality to maintain internal autonomy while gaining the security of a larger, more powerful protector. For the Grimaldis, this was a delicate position to manage. While sovereignty was now formally acknowledged, it came with quiet obligations. French influence, never heavy-handed, was nonetheless pervasive. Envoys travelled frequently between Paris and Monaco. French was increasingly used in official correspondence. Cultural customs, fashions, and courtly expectations began to mirror those of the French nobility. Louis I, who ruled through much of the later 17th century, embraced this association. Educated at the French court, he carried himself with an ease that suited the salons of Paris as much as the narrow corridors of the palace in Monaco. He sought to refine his domain, introducing small reforms in administration, improving the legal codex, and encouraging polite manners among the town's modest elite. Yet Louis also understood the limits of his realm. Monaco remained diminutive. Just a few hundred residents, a small harbour, and a rocky outcrop of stone and soil. Its military capacity was symbolic at best, its economy reliant on fishing, modest trade, and occasional stipends from its protector. Governance required thrift and tact more than ambition. The Treaty of Péronne had brought stability, but it also set Monaco on a careful path. Ever independent, but never entirely alone. Within the principality, daily life remained unchanged in many respects. The rhythms of the sea, the seasons, and the church continued to shape existence. Fishermen cast their nets before dawn, women tended to terraced gardens and rooftop chickens, and children learned their letters, if they were lucky, under the watchful eye of a priest or monk. Festivals offered moments of collective joy. On Saint Devote's Day, the town gathered in procession, her relics carried with reverence through winding streets. At Christmas and Easter, the chapel bells rang with fuller voice, and tables bore what bounty could be found: roasted fish, sweet bread, perhaps a glass of local wine. Weddings were celebrated with modest cheer, funerals observed with solemnity and song. The palace, though still practical in its foundations, was slowly transformed. Frescoes depicting scenes from the Grimaldi lineage were added to reception rooms. Tapestries from Lyon and Avignon softened the stone walls. A small library was assembled, containing both theological texts and classical volumes. A gallery of family portraits, rendered by regional painters, lined a hallway near the great staircase. The town expanded slightly, with homes built into the rock's lower slopes, and a few shops appearing along what passed for a central street. A baker, a cooper, a tailor, each offering their wares from small shaded entrances. Boats bobbed in the harbour, now better protected by a stone jetty. Visitors, merchants, envoys or pilgrims occasionally passed through, leaving behind stories and the faint trace of foreign perfume. Despite its smallness, Monaco was no backwater. Its location ensured it remained part of the Mediterranean network. From Marseille to Genoa, from Nice to Barcelona, the rock was known. Ships flying the Grimaldi banner sailed cautiously but with purpose. Their presence in foreign ports reminded others that this principality, however tiny, existed still. Throughout the early 18th century, Monaco's fortunes remained steady, if modest. Charles III, who came to power in the 1730s, continued his predecessor's policies of prudent governance. He invested in the maintenance of fortifications, not out of expectation of war, but as a symbol of sovereignty. He maintained close relations with Versailles, hosting visiting dignitaries with simple but thoughtful hospitality. Monaco's official documents now bore the French fleur-de-lis alongside the Grimaldi lozenge. This visual blending of identities spoke to the reality of Monaco's place in the world, French in friendship, Monegasque in name. The Treaty of Péronne, renewed and referenced often, remained a touchstone of the principality's diplomacy. Beyond the palace, the world continued to shift. The Enlightenment stirred in Parisian salons, and ideas of reason, rights, and reform began to circulate among Europe's literate class. In Monaco, these ideas arrived slowly, first in conversation, then in books borrowed or brought by guests. The prince's advisors, some trained in law or philosophy, began to debate softly the future of governance. But for most citizens, life remained as it had always been, tied to the land, to the tides, and to the gentle certainties of faith. The latter decades of the century brought challenges. Economic pressures mounted. A poor harvest in the 1770s led to hardship. Disease, likely carried by trade routes, visited the harbour again. The Grimaldis responded with charity where they could, opening stores of grain, easing levies. But the resources were limited, and the suffering, though never catastrophic, left its mark. Yet the greatest upheaval was still ahead. By the 1780s, rumblings from across the border grew louder. In France, unrest turned to revolution. The Ancien Regime began to crumble. And for Monaco, nestled in quiet alliance with the French crown, this would soon mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The 18th century, as it stretched toward its final decades, cast a softer light upon Europe, one tempered not by fire or war, but by thought. This was the age of enlightenment, when minds turned gently away from absolutism and toward ideas of balance, liberty, and rational inquiry. Across salons and studies, from Paris to Edinburgh, new philosophies emerged, challenging the old order and offering, often with quiet confidence, visions of a better ordered world. Monaco, ever a modest spectator to the movements of empires and intellects, did not lead this wave, but it did not remain untouched. By the middle of the century, the principality was under the rule of Honoré III, who came to power in 1733 as a young man and remained prince for more than 60 years. His reign, long and largely peaceful, would carry Monaco through the full arc of the Enlightenment and into the tremors of revolution beyond. Honoré III was a thoughtful man, educated in France, fluent in Latin and Italian, and versed in the political philosophies that had begun to circulate among the European elite. He corresponded with scholars, welcomed guests of learning to his court, and maintained a growing collection of books and pamphlets. In a quiet study within the palace, with windows overlooking the sea, he read Locke and Montesquieu, Voltaire and Rousseau, and considered in his own time what their arguments might mean for a place as small and particular as Monaco. He did not see in them a threat, but rather a guide, a gentle path toward reform, not upheaval. Under Honoré's governance, small but meaningful changes were introduced. The principality's administrative structure was clarified, with clearer records kept of births, deaths, and property. Legal processes were refined, with an emphasis on equity and the codification of customary law. Taxation, long a matter of negotiation and local variance, was standardized somewhat, ensuring that obligations were predictable, if still modest in scale. Education, too, received attention. The Jesuit presence, though reduced by papal decree elsewhere in Europe, continued to offer instruction in Monaco, supported now by secular tutors and clerks. A small grammar school was founded where boys learned to read, write, and count, skills increasingly necessary in a world that demanded ledgers and contracts as much as nets and sails. Girls, though less formally educated, received instruction from the church, particularly in the catechism and household skills. Trade remained the lifeblood of the principality, modest though it was. The harbour welcomed small vessels bearing goods from Marseille, Genoa, and occasionally Corsica. Dried fish, olive oil, and preserved lemons were the main exports. Fabrics, grains, and tools the usual imports. The port, now slightly expanded and made more secure by new sea walls, bustled with cautious energy. Beneath the palace, the town itself had become slightly more refined. A new street was laid, straight and narrow, with gutters and lamps. The main square hosted a weekly market where fishmongers, cheesemakers, and fruit sellers set out their wares beneath awnings of faded canvas. A few coffee houses had begun to appear, simple places furnished with wooden stools and small tables where seafarers and merchants exchanged gossip over steaming mugs. Honoré III, for all his princely title, lived simply. His court was small, less than 24 regular attendants, and his habits restrained. He rose early, took breakfast in his chambers, met with his advisers in a wood-panelled hall, and walked each afternoon along the ramparts. He dined modestly and preferred conversation to spectacle. On feast days, he attended Mass at St. Nicholas Church, seated quietly among his townsfolk. His presence was neither aloof nor performative. He was, in the end, more steward than sovereign. Yet beyond the borders of his principality, the world was stirring. From the 1760s onward, political discourse in France became increasingly animated. Pamphlets circulated widely, critiquing privilege and proposing new social contracts. The American Revolution in 1776, watched from afar, seemed to confirm that distant ideas could indeed manifest into real structural change. Honoré, though wary, read the reports with interest. He introduced no grand reforms, no declarations of rights, no abolitions of titles, but he continued to govern with fairness, ensuring that Monaco did not present itself as a symbol of aristocratic excess. His court grew quieter still, and his expenditures remained modest. He hoped, perhaps, that by embodying the gentler ideals of enlightened rule, he might guide his domain through the coming storm. But storms do not always respect moderation. By the late 1780s, famine and unrest were rising in France. Bread riots turned to protest, protests turned to revolution. The Bastille was stormed in 1789, and soon after, the monarchy itself began to unravel. For Monaco, so closely tied to France by language, culture, and treaty, the implications were profound. Honoré III, a prince of reason and routine, suddenly found himself aligned with a collapsing world. Though he had never ruled harshly, nor claimed divine right, he was nonetheless a sovereign, and therefore, by the reckoning of the revolutionaries, an emblem of the old order. By 1790, French revolutionary forces began to view Monaco not as a friend, but as a possession. The treaty that had long safeguarded its autonomy was disregarded. In 1793, French troops entered the principality without resistance. Monaco was annexed into the French Republic as the Fort Hercules district, part of the Alpes-Maritimes. The Grimaldi rule was suspended. Honoré III, now an old man, was arrested and transported to Paris. He was imprisoned during the height of the Reign of Terror, and although he survived the guillotine, he emerged frail and sorrowful. He died in 1795, never having returned to the Rock. For Monaco, the Age of Enlightenment had ended not in revolution, but in quiet occupation. The town remained. The chapel, the harbour, the red-tiled roofs. But the prince was gone. The flag lowered, and the streets watched over not by familiar eyes, but by Republican officials from Nice. And still, the sea lapped at the shore, indifferent to the banners above. As the final decade of the 18th century gave way to the 19th, Monaco, long governed by the careful stewardship of the Grimaldi, found itself adrift beneath the vast and swirling currents of French revolutionary ambition. The principality, once protected and then annexed, had become a mere administrative subdivision, its centuries of measured autonomy dissolved into the fabric of a republic that was itself constantly shifting. The Rock remained, of course, and the people upon it continued their lives, but their sovereign had vanished, and the shape of authority above them was now unfamiliar. From 1793, Monaco was absorbed into France under the name Fort d'Hercule. It was administered not as a sovereign state, but as a locality within the département of Alpes-Maritimes. Revolutionary officials were dispatched to oversee this new territory, bringing with them both administrative rigour and ideological fervour. Statues of saints were removed or defaced, royal insignia chipped from stone. The chapel of Saint-Devote, though spared destruction, was subject to closure for a time, as the revolutionary state sought to impose secular ideals on all areas under its control. For the Monegasque population, small, closely knit, and accustomed to the gentle rhythms of princely rule, these changes were bewildering. The new officials brought laws that were sweeping and impersonal, delivered in French accents that did not always match the local tongue. Civil marriages were instituted, church records were replaced with secular ones, and property once held by the church or the Grimaldi was declared national and redistributed. In some cases, former palatial rooms were converted into storage or administrative offices. The palace itself, empty and echoing, sat as a quiet monument to what had been. Yet for all the upheaval, the town remained remarkably intact. The Rock's isolation, once a limitation, now offered a degree of insulation. While cities like Lyon and Marseille experienced violence and suppression, Monaco experienced a quieter occupation. Its size made large revolutionary assemblies unnecessary, and its people, though loyal to the memory of their prince, were largely pragmatic. They adapted. Fishermen still went to sea. The baker still rose before dawn. Children still chased each other through the alleyways between gardened terraces. In 1799, the revolution entered a new phase. Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican general of growing fame, seized control of the French government in a coup d'etat and declared himself first consul. With him came a new era, less chaotic, more centralized. For Monaco, now securely within the French state, this meant administrative stability, if not independence. Napoleon's government retained Monaco's integration, but allowed for a degree of regional autonomy in practice. Local figures were once again allowed to participate in governance, though always under the watchful eye of Paris. French laws applied in full, conscription included, and a number of young Monegasque men were drafted into the Napoleonic armies. Some were sent to Italy, others to Spain. Their stories, though largely unrecorded, became part of the broader tapestry of the Napoleonic era, small lives swept into great movements. By 1804, Napoleon declared himself Emperor of the French. From the grandeur of coronation in Notre Dame to the march of legions across Europe, his reign reshaped the continent. Monaco remained quiet, overlooked in the imperial grandeur, but not forgotten. Occasionally, imperial officials passed through the town, inspecting fortifications or requisitioning supplies. Taxes were collected more regularly. The harbour, though still small, was included on naval charts. A modest customs post was established, complete with a tricolour flag that fluttered above the quay. Still, for most residents, life remained rooted in routine. The revolutionary calendar, with its 10-day weeks and renamed months, was quietly ignored after a time. Old customs resurfaced, the church reopened, and the Feast of Saint-Devote resumed, albeit in less public fashion. The prince was not spoken of loudly, but his absence was felt. His portrait, in many homes, was hidden but not destroyed. The death of Honoré III in 1795 had left the Grimaldi lineage in uncertain hands. His son, Honoré IV, was recognized by supporters as the rightful Prince of Monaco, though he had no power within the annexed state. Living quietly in France, he watched events unfold, ever hoping for restoration. That opportunity came with Napoleon's downfall. In 1814, after the failed Russian campaign and the defeat of French forces by Allied armies, the First French Empire began to collapse. Napoleon abdicated in April and was exiled to the island of Elba. France, now governed by the restored Bourbon monarchy, began the process of undoing revolutionary annexations and returning sovereignty to smaller states. Among these was Monaco. The Treaty of Paris, signed in May 1814, recognized the independence of Monaco once more. Yet sovereignty was to come with a condition. Monaco would now be placed under the protection of the Kingdom of Sardinia, a regional power based in Turin with its own ambitions and priorities. It was not the restoration the Grimaldis had once known, but it was a return, and for the first time in more than 2 decades, the flag of Monaco was raised above the palace once more. Honoré IV, now in his 60s and suffering from ill health, returned to the principality. His presence was brief, his reign largely symbolic. It would be his son, Honoré V, who would assume the responsibilities of rule, and with him would come the challenges of rebuilding a state that had, for a generation, existed only in memory. The people of Monaco, tired but intact, welcomed the return. The palace was reopened. The church bells pealed again. The rock, as always, remained, and upon it, life began once more to resume its careful, sovereign rhythm. The early decades of the 19th century brought with them a subdued kind of hope for Monaco, a restoration not marked by triumph or pomp, but by the slow, deliberate resumption of ordinary sovereignty. The Grimaldi dynasty, absent for more than 20 years, returned to the rock in the fragile aftermath of Napoleonic upheaval. The principality itself, unchanged in outline, but transformed by the passage of time, welcomed back its rulers like an old coat reclaimed from a cupboard, familiar, serviceable, but needing repair. Honoré IV, restored in name as Prince of Monaco in 1814, was by then an aging man, marked by years of house arrest and declining health. His return was dignified but brief, though he resumed residence in the palace and formally re-established the institutions of rule. Much of the practical governance fell to his son, Honoré V, who took on increasing responsibility even before his father's death in 1819. Honoré V's tenure, lasting until 1841, was characterized by a blend of personal economy and cautious reform. Monaco, in the wake of its annexation and years under foreign administration, required rebuilding, not just in physical terms, but in spirit. Records had been lost or neglected, revenues were thin, and the town bore the subtle marks of a place that had endured rather than flourished. With limited resources, Honoré V focused on restoring essential functions. The principality's modest legal code was revived and clarified, administrative offices were reopened, and old titles and honours quietly reinstated. The Chapel of Saint-Devote was again a site of pilgrimage and ceremony, its services marking the return of tradition. The prince walked the narrow streets, visited the market, and spoke with fishermen and traders. He listened, if not always with answers, then at least with attentiveness. Still, the constraints were real. Monaco's economy remained largely agrarian and maritime, and its hinterland, comprising the towns of Menton and Roquebrune, provided the bulk of its income. These neighbouring communes, under Monegasque rule since the Middle Ages, were larger and more productive than the Rock itself. Their taxes supported the palace, their crops filled the markets, yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The people of Menton and Roquebrune, culturally closer to the Italian Riviera and linguistically distinct from the Monegasques of the Rock, began to grow restless under what they perceived as distant and aristocratic rule. Their calls for representation, for local governance, and for reform grew steadily through the 1830s. The winds of liberalism that swept through Europe, gently at first, then with greater force, found their way into these valleys and coastal towns. Honoré V, conservative by temperament, met these stirrings with resistance. He held to the old model of princely rule, guided more by duty than by adaptation. He levied taxes carefully, but without local consultation. He issued edicts, but rarely permitted dialogue. Though he was neither cruel nor indifferent, his methods increasingly felt outdated in a world beginning to ask new questions about the relationship between ruler and ruled. When Honoré V died in 1841, he was succeeded by his brother, Florestan IV, a man of more academic inclination, with little political experience. Florestan had spent much of his life in Paris, immersed in literature and the arts. His accession was unexpected, and his early years as prince were marked by uncertainty. Yet he brought with him an openness to reform and an awareness of the world beyond Monaco's narrow streets. With the support of his wife, Princess Caroline, a woman of strong will and practical acumen, Florestan began to introduce cautious liberalization. He established a consultative council composed of local notables, permitted greater press freedoms, and encouraged educational initiatives. These measures, though modest, marked a clear shift from the insularity of previous reigns. Yet Florestan faced growing unrest in Menton and Roquebrune. The revolutions of 1848, which swept across Europe from Paris to Milan, gave voice to the grievances of these towns. Encouraged by revolutionary sentiment and Italian nationalist movements, Menton and Roquebrune declared independence from Monaco and placed themselves under the protection of the Kingdom of Sardinia. Though no violence erupted, the loss was deeply felt. These towns had been integral to the principality's identity and economy. Their departure halved Monaco's size and diminished its revenues substantially. Florestan, unable to prevent the secessions and lacking the military or diplomatic weight to contest them, governed thereafter with reduced means. The palace grew quieter, the budget tighter. Yet within Monaco itself, the prince retained the support of many townspeople. His reforms, though slow and incomplete, fostered a sense of modernization. Schools expanded their curricula. Local committees were consulted more regularly. The post of magistrate was given greater independence. In 1856, Florestan died, and his son Charles III succeeded him. With a sharp mind and a practical sensibility, Charles took stock of a principality that was now a shadow of its territorial past, but still sovereign, still independent. The Rock remained. The harbour, though modest, still welcomed ships. The chapel still drew worshippers, and the name Grimaldi still commanded a measure of respect. Charles understood that Monaco would not regain its lost towns. Instead, he began to look inward and forward. The principality needed a new foundation, not in land or arms, but in enterprise. That vision, still unformed in the 1850s, would soon take shape in a way that would redefine Monaco forever. But for now, the Rock was quiet. The waves lapped at its base. The prince walked its paths, and the slow, steady work of governance continued. The quiet loss of Menton and Roquebrune in 1848 marked a profound turning point for Monaco, a rupture not through fire or conquest, but through steady erosion. These two towns, perched gently along the coast to the east of the Rock, had for centuries provided the principality with much of its land, population, and agricultural wealth. With their departure, Monaco shrank dramatically in both size and capacity, retreating into itself once more. And yet, the story of their separation is not one of rage, but of quiet divergence, two histories long intertwined that gradually grew apart. In the years leading up to 1848, signs of restlessness in the two communes had become increasingly clear. Though under Monegasque rule since the late Middle Ages, Menton and Roquebrune had always retained distinct characters, linguistically, economically, and culturally. The people of Menton, in particular, looked east toward the Italian Riviera with familiarity. Their dialect bore closer resemblance to Genoese Ligurian than to the French spoken in Monaco. Their economy, rooted in citrus groves and olive oil, was robust, and their sense of identity was strong. As liberal ideas spread through Europe in the early 19th century, carried by books, pamphlets, and returning students, the townspeople began to question their place within the small, princely framework of Monaco. They paid taxes to a distant palace, yet had little say in governance. They saw the rise of constitutional movements in Sardinia and elsewhere, and began to imagine a different kind of future, one less bound by dynastic heritage and more open to civic participation. Florestan I, though sympathetic in spirit, lacked the political strength to stem the tide. His reforms were gentle and limited, and his power constrained by Monaco's tiny bureaucracy and even tinier treasury. He could neither afford nor enforce measures that might have appeased his restive neighbours. And so, when the revolutionary tide of 1848 broke across Europe, bringing down monarchies and igniting nationalist fervour, Menton and Roquebrune seized the moment. With little resistance, they declared their separation from Monaco and placed themselves under the protection of the Kingdom of Sardinia, a growing force in the Italian unification movement. The act was not violent. No shots were fired, but its meaning was unambiguous. The two towns no longer wished to be ruled by Monaco, and Monaco, lacking the military or diplomatic strength to prevent it, was left to absorb the blow. For years afterward, the issue remained unresolved. Monaco did not relinquish its claims immediately, nor did Sardinia move swiftly to formalize the annexation. Instead, the towns existed in a kind of diplomatic limbo, governed in practice by Sardinia, but claimed in principle by Monaco. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the Grimaldi court. Prince Florestan, already worn by the burdens of rule, grew quieter. He delegated more to his wife, Princess Caroline, and eventually to their son, Charles. His death in 1856 passed quietly, and Charles III assumed the throne amid a principality now reduced to the rock and its immediate harbour, a mere shadow of the territorial Monaco of old. Charles faced a stark reality. With the loss of Menton and Roquebrune, Monaco's agricultural base was gone. Its treasury, never large, had dwindled further. The town itself, while stable, offered little room for economic growth. The palace, though proud and stately, now presided over a principality that could barely sustain itself. And yet, Charles did not despair. Instead, he began to look for new possibilities, new foundations upon which Monaco's future might be built. But even as he turned his thoughts toward innovation, the issue of Menton and Roquebrune remained a lingering wound. It was not until 1861 that the matter was formally resolved. Under the Franco-Monegasque Treaty signed that year, Monaco ceded all claims to the two towns in exchange for compensation from France. The Kingdom of Sardinia, now a key player in the movement toward Italian unification, transferred its claims to France, and Menton and Roquebrune were absorbed into French territory. For Monaco, this was the end of an era. The principality, once extending several miles along the coast, was now confined to its ancient rock and a narrow strip of land descending to the sea. It was the second smallest state in Europe by land area, larger only than the Vatican. Yet, in a way, the treaty offered clarity. Monaco now had fixed borders, guaranteed by international agreement. Its sovereignty, once questioned, was affirmed. And with the financial compensation received from France, Charles III had a modest foundation upon which to begin a new chapter. Within the town, life continued. The fishermen still rose before dawn. The priests still rang the chapel bells. Children still played in shaded lanes. The rock, though smaller in domain, remained whole. Its spirit, resilient, quietly proud, endured. And Charles, walking the terraces of the palace, gazing down at the blue sweep of the Mediterranean, began to form an idea. If the land could no longer support Monaco, perhaps the sea and those who came to its shores might. But that, of course, is another story. In the early 1860s, with the borders of Monaco newly defined and its treasury modestly replenished through the Franco-Monegasque Treaty, Prince Charles III found himself governing a principality at once secure and imperiled. Secure in that its sovereignty had been reaffirmed and its independence guaranteed by treaty. Imperiled because, stripped of Menton and Roquebrune, it possessed no farmland of consequence, no industry, no tax base of sufficient strength. It was, to all intents, a rock with a harbour, a chapel and a palace, beautiful but unsustainable by tradition alone. Charles, reflective and forward-thinking, understood that the old Monaco, the one of coastal holdings and agricultural tenants, was gone. If the principality were to endure, it would have to become something new. It was around this time that a curious idea took root. Gambling, long frowned upon or outright banned in much of Europe, remained in demand among the continent's upper classes. In France and Italy, restrictions on gaming were becoming more stringent. Yet the appetite for games of chance, roulette, baccarat 21 persisted, particularly among the wealthy, the idle, and the curious. Charles saw an opportunity. If Monaco could not support itself through traditional means, perhaps it could sustain itself by catering to others. The plan was simple in outline, though complex in execution. A casino, a proper licensed gaming establishment, would be opened within Monaco. It would attract foreign visitors, generate revenue through concessions and licenses, and in time become a magnet for tourism. The idea had been discussed before, and an initial attempt had been made in the late 1850s under the guidance of various concessionaires. But those early efforts had faltered, hampered by poor location, inadequate infrastructure, and disorganized management. Charles III, determined to see it succeed, took a more focused approach. In 1863, he granted a new concession to a French businessman named François Blanc, an experienced operator who had already overseen the success of the casino at Bad Homburg in Germany. Blanc brought with him capital, experience, and a vision. He saw that Monaco's appeal lay not in its size or influence, but in its climate, its vistas, and its potential for reinvention. The site selected for the casino was a quiet promontory just beyond the main town, an area then known simply as Les Spélugues, or the Caves. It was little more than rocky terrain and coastal scrubland, sparsely inhabited and difficult to access. Blanc began developing it with purpose, building not only the gaming hall itself, but also a hotel, a theatre, and promenades. Roads were laid, gardens planted, and gas lamps installed. The project, ambitious and costly, transformed the once barren slope into a burgeoning destination. By 1864, the new casino opened its doors. Its interior was elegant but not ostentatious, decorated in the ornate style favoured by the Second Empire, with gilded mouldings, heavy curtains, and grand chandeliers. Uniformed staff attended the tables, and the sound of roulette wheels and card shuffles filled the air. At first, the clientele was limited. Adventurous Frenchmen, the occasional Englishman wintering along the coast, but gradually the word spread. The location, once a hindrance, became part of the appeal. The train line connecting Monaco to the rest of the Riviera was completed shortly thereafter, making access easier. Carriages began to arrive daily from Nice, Cannes, and Menton, bringing guests dressed for the tables. Hotels multiplied. A modest seaside path was replaced with a grand avenue, and cafes sprang up offering champagne and oysters beneath striped awnings. Blanc's development was given a new name, Monte Carlo, or Mount Charles, in honour of the prince. The name, chosen with quiet pride, came to represent not just a part of the principality, but a transformation of its spirit. Monte Carlo became the symbol of Monaco's second birth, not as a feudal relic, but as a cosmopolitan enclave of leisure and luxury. Prince Charles III, though not a gambler himself, embraced the success with reserved satisfaction. The revenues from the casino were substantial and, most importantly, steady. They allowed the principality to abolish direct taxation on its citizens, a policy still in place today, and to fund infrastructure, schools, and cultural programs. New buildings were erected. The palace was maintained with greater care. The town expanded slightly, and the population grew with the arrival of workers, tradesmen, and administrators. Yet for all its prosperity, the casino brought changes that were not purely material. The character of Monaco shifted. The streets now heard many languages: French, English, German, Russian. The fashions of Paris and Vienna arrived by rail. Newspapers from London and Rome were available at the kiosks. The cafes filled with conversation, music, and speculation. The principality, once quiet and provincial, now pulsed with seasonal rhythm. Winter visitors, spring departures, summer calm, and autumn preparations. Not all residents approved. Some older families regarded the influx with suspicion, concerned that Monaco's soul might be bartered for coin. The church, too, voiced occasional unease at the gaming and decadence it associated with the casino's clientele. But the benefits were hard to ignore. Employment rose. Standards of living improved. The town was clean, safe, and increasingly known to the outside world. Charles III ruled until his death in 1889, overseeing nearly 3 decades of quiet transformation. His reign was not marked by conquest or invention, but by adaptation, an act no less significant. He left behind a principality that, while tiny and peculiar, had found its place in the modern world. The rock still stood, crowned by its palace. The sea still whispered, but now, just beyond, in the halls of Monte Carlo, fortunes turned on the spin of a wheel, and the future of Monaco unfolded in quiet increments beneath chandeliers and stars. When Charles III passed away in 1889, he left behind a principality transformed, not in scale, for Monaco remained one of the smallest states in Europe, but in purpose, prestige, and perception. The once quiet coastal outpost had become a recognized destination, its name associated with elegance, chance, and a peculiar kind of restrained grandeur. His successor, Albert I, inherited not only a throne, but a vision, one rooted in continuity, but with the freedom to imagine more. Albert I, a thoughtful and scientifically minded man, differed in temperament from his father. While Charles had focused on financial solvency and development through leisure, Albert turned his gaze outward, to the sea, to science, and to the evolving landscape of ideas. His reign, from 1889 to 1922, was marked not by dramatic change, but by refinement and the deepening of Monaco's cultural life. A passionate oceanographer, Albert established what would become one of Monaco's most enduring institutions, the Oceanographic Museum. Perched atop the cliffs above the sea, it was not merely a collection of exhibits, but a centre of study and education filled with specimens, maps, and instruments. Researchers from across Europe visited. Lectures were held in its vaulted halls. The building itself, designed in the Beaux-Arts style, rose like a cliffside cathedral, its windows looking out upon the very waters it studied. Albert's interest in science extended to exploration. He funded expeditions to the Arctic and Mediterranean, documenting marine life and contributing to the growing field of oceanography. Monaco, through him, gained a quiet reputation as a place of inquiry and intellect, not just of roulette and revelry. The prince's writings on peace and diplomacy earned him recognition beyond his borders. He attended international conferences, promoted disarmament, and advocated for cooperation in an increasingly fractured world. And yet the principality remained small. Its fortunes, still tied in large part to the casino, waxed and waned with the patterns of European travel. Winters brought visitors. Summers grew quiet. The palace stood above it all, serene, unchanged, watching over a domain that was at once timeless and quietly evolving. The early 20th century, however, brought new trials. The First World War, which engulfed Europe from 1914 to 1918, did not directly touch Monaco's soil, but it disrupted the flow of visitors and commerce. The hotels fell quiet. Steamships no longer called at the harbour. Albert I, ever diplomatic, maintained a posture of neutrality while offering humanitarian support. Monaco hosted convalescent soldiers, provided financial aid to affected regions, and preserved its sovereignty amidst the storm. Following the war, Albert's final years were marked by a return to quietude. He died in 1922, and his son, Louis II, ascended the throne. Louis, a veteran of the war and a man of more martial character, brought a different energy to the role. His reign, which would last until 1949, spanned a time of profound global upheaval, economic depression, the rise of fascism, and the devastation of a Second World War. Louis II's approach to rule was pragmatic. He maintained Monaco's institutions, oversaw modest reforms, and sought to preserve stability amid growing uncertainty. Yet his reign was marked by a degree of aloofness. He spent long periods abroad, and within Monaco he was seen as somewhat remote. The casino remained prosperous through the 1920s, but the Great Depression of the 1930s reduced travel, and with it, revenues. The principality adapted, but its reliance on gaming became increasingly evident. During the Second World War, Monaco once again declared neutrality. Its position, nestled between occupied France and fascist Italy, made it vulnerable. German troops entered in 1942, and though the occupation was relatively restrained, it left deep marks, particularly in the treatment of Monaco's small Jewish population, many of whom were deported. The war passed, but the scars remained. By the time Louis II neared the end of his reign, Monaco was in need of renewal. Its economy was fragile, its population dwindling, and its image, so carefully cultivated under Charles and Albert, had grown a little faded. The world was changing, rapidly and visibly, and the principality, so small and particular, risked being left behind. In 1949, Louis II died, and his grandson, Rainier III, ascended the throne at the age of 25. Rainier inherited a principality both poised and precarious. The foundations laid by his ancestors were solid, but the world around them was different now, faster, louder, more skeptical. The aristocratic leisure of Monte Carlo no longer drew crowds in quite the same way. Post-war Europe was rebuilding, reimagining itself. Monaco would need to do the same. Rainier, thoughtful and modern in outlook, recognized that Monaco's future would not be secured by roulette wheels alone. He sought to diversify the economy, to modernize governance, and to reframe Monaco's identity. He introduced reforms to the constitution, developed new housing and infrastructure, and encouraged international investment. Under his reign, Monaco became not only a haven for tourists, but a centre for finance, culture, and diplomacy. Yet perhaps his most famous act was one of quiet symbolism. In 1956, he married Grace Kelly, the American actress, in a ceremony that captivated global attention. The union, a blend of old-world royalty and modern celebrity, brought renewed interest to Monaco. Tourists returned, journalists arrived, and the principality entered the modern consciousness in a new way. The palace, long a quiet seat of governance, became a focal point of interest. Monte Carlo flourished anew. Monaco's population grew, its economy expanded, and its sovereignty remained intact. Rainier would rule for over 50 years, guiding Monaco from post-war fragility to late 20th century prosperity. But the roots of that journey, the quiet groundwork, had been laid decades earlier by Charles, Albert, and Louis, by the rock and those who called it home. The sea still whispered, the gulls still circled, and the flag still flew, red and white above stone. As the 20th century gave way to its final decades, the Principality of Monaco found itself in a state both familiar and transformed. The rock remained, unchanged in silhouette, still capped by the pale walls and tiled roofs of the Grimaldi Palace. But beneath it, the world had shifted. No longer merely a fortress, nor simply a resort town, Monaco had become a state with global connections, a curious mixture of tradition and innovation balanced upon less than 1 square mile of Mediterranean stone. Rainier III, whose long reign from 1949 to 2005 provided Monaco with rare continuity, was at the heart of this quiet transformation. His early reforms, economic, political, and administrative, had helped to modernize the Principality's foundations, but it was his long stewardship, his careful negotiation between sovereignty and openness that truly defined the age. Through a mix of statecraft, symbolism, and a gently adaptive spirit, he brought Monaco steadily into the modern world. The marriage to Grace Kelly in 1956, so often spoken of in headlines and retrospectives, brought with it more than just glamour. It signalled a willingness on Monaco's part to engage with the wider world, not through might or diplomacy, but through presence. The union attracted global attention, and with it came journalists, filmmakers, and tourists. The Principality, already known for its casino and its race, now became known also for its royal family, an institution both ancient and newly vibrant. Grace, as Princess of Monaco, adopted her role with grace and care. Though she appeared in no further films after her marriage, she brought to her public life a calm dignity. She presided over cultural functions, supported charitable endeavours, and worked to promote the arts. Her presence softened the lines of statehood, adding warmth to ceremony and drawing admiration from far beyond the Riviera. Meanwhile, Rainier worked quietly to reshape Monaco's economy. He recognized that reliance on gaming alone would not suffice. With deliberation, he opened the Principality to international banking and investment, developing a reputation for fiscal stability and confidentiality. New laws were introduced to regulate finance, infrastructure was upgraded, and Monaco's reputation shifted from a playground to a jurisdiction, from a novelty to a centre. Housing expanded too. As Monaco grew in stature, its population increased, and with it the demand for space. Ingenious engineering solutions were adopted, buildings rose higher, and land was reclaimed from the sea. The Fontvieille district, completed in the 1980s, added a significant new area to the Principality, carved literally from the waters of the Mediterranean. Parks, housing, a stadium, and a heliport were constructed, all within sight of the old rock, which stood sentinel as ever. Yet even as Monaco modernized, it held fast to its ceremonial heart. National Day, celebrated each November, retained its rituals. The gathering on the palace square, the balcony appearance of the princely family, the echo of footsteps on flagstones. The chapel remained active, its bells ringing out across the roofs and harbour. The Oceanographic Museum continued its work, now in cooperation with international marine organisations. The Grimaldi name, once linked only to a fortress seized in disguise, now adorned diplomatic letters, charitable foundations, and cultural institutions. Tragedy, however, was not absent. In 1982, Princess Grace died in a car accident on the winding coastal road above Monaco. Her death was a blow not only to the royal family, but to the people of the Principality. Her funeral was attended by dignitaries from around the world, and the outpouring of public grief was profound. Yet her memory endured, in the foundation established in her name, in the quiet dignity with which her family carried on, and in the hearts of many who had never met her. In the years that followed, Rainier continued to govern with steadiness. His children, Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie, took on various public duties, though not without their own trials and personal complexities. The Principality itself remained outwardly unchanged, yet inwardly ever adjusting. quiet reforms to succession laws, environmental initiatives, careful negotiation of international treaties. The old and the new continued to walk side by side. When Rainier III died in 2005, he had ruled longer than any prince before him. His son, Albert II, succeeded him with little ceremony and much expectation. Albert, educated abroad and active in environmental diplomacy, brought a new kind of energy, more global in tone yet anchored in tradition. His reign, still ongoing, has been marked by increased transparency, environmental leadership, and continued efforts to secure Monaco's place in a fast-changing world. Under Albert, Monaco has taken bold steps. It has become carbon neutral in key areas, sponsored scientific research in polar regions, and strengthened international cooperation. The Principality has also embraced digital innovation while maintaining its status as a low-tax jurisdiction. It has hosted global forums, supported humanitarian efforts, and continued to present itself as a small nation with an outsized sense of responsibility. Culturally, Monaco remains vibrant. The Monte Carlo Philharmonic, the Ballet de Monte Carlo, and the many festivals and exhibitions keep the Principality at the cultural edge of Europe. The Grand Prix, winding through the tight corners of city streets, remains a highlight of the international racing calendar. The sea, the harbour, the hills, they all remain, but now they echo with new voices, new rhythms. And still, the rock endures. As the 21st century advances, Monaco's identity remains a delicate mosaic, an ancient principality ruled by a family whose name stretches back to the 13th century, a modern microstate engaged with finance, diplomacy, and science, a haven of stability in an often unstable world. It is neither a relic nor a utopia, but something subtler, a place that has chosen, again and again, to adapt without forgetting, to endure without fading. The palace still stands above the harbour, the red and white flag still flutters in the sea air, and the sea, ever unchanged, laps gently against the shore, carrying forward the quiet story of a small place that has persisted patiently through the long passage of time.